Welcome everyone for being here on a Monday afternoon. I'm Margaret Seitz. I am a founding member of the National Lawyers Guild Brandeis. We are a co-sponsor of this event along with American Constitution Society, ACLU Brandeis, the International Law Society, and the Kentucky Interfaith Task Force on Latin America and the Caribbean. I appreciate everyone's help in getting this event together today. I want to talk a little bit about NLG. We are a relatively new organization, and this is the second event that we've hosted in our first year as a student organization. And one of the things that NLG seeks to do in our pursuit of the ultimate goal of justice is to forge connections between attorneys and the legal community and activists and community organizers. And we want to uplift the work of advocates that are from affected communities. So that's what we did at our first event that we did in the fall, which was a movement lawyering panel where we hosted activists from Project South, Black Lives Matter, and Mi Gente Louisville in conversation with local attorneys about how they work together and how those relationships work. And today we're excited to welcome Dan Kovalik, someone who has strived to make those kind of connections in his career. Dan teaches international human rights law at the University of Pittsburgh. He has written extensively on the issues of international human rights and U.S. foreign policy for the Huffington Post and Counterpunch, and has lectured throughout the world on these subjects. Dan recently retired from his position as Senior Associate General Counsel of the United Steelworkers, where he worked for 25 years following his graduation from Columbia Law School in '93. While with the USW, he has served as lead counsel on cutting-edge labor law litigation, including the landmark NLRB cases of Landman's Gasket and Specialty Healthcare. He has also worked on Alien Tort Claims Act cases against the Coca-Cola Company, Drummond and Occidental Petroleum, and cases arising out of egregious human rights abuses in Colombia. The Christian Science Monitor, referring to his work defending Colombian unionists under threat of assassination, has described Mr. Kovalik as one of the most prominent defenders of Colombian workers in the United States. And Mr. Kovalik was a recipient of the Project Censored Award for his article exposing the unprecedented killing of trade unionists in Colombia. Dan's new book, which is coming out in June, is called The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela, How the U.S. is Orchestrating a Coup for Oil, with a foreword by Oliver Stone. This is an extremely important and pressing development in the world, and Dan has actually just come back from Caracas, Venezuela, where he's been doing journalistic work, so he knows everything that's going on, and he's going to tell us all about it, in addition to giving us a crash course on international law. He's here today just to talk to us. He flew in this morning, and he's leaving this afternoon, so we are so grateful for him being here today. Everybody welcome Dan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm so excited to be here. Another part of my biography is that I was born in Louisville, Kentucky, so, though I can't pronounce Louisville, apparently. But that's okay. I haven't been here in 50 years. But I'm very excited to be here. And because it is, looks like about half law students, I do want to open up and talk about the law, because I think actually in this case it's very helpful in thinking about the international issues like the one involving Venezuela. And it's important because I believe that the worst fixation of very well-intentioned people in the West and in the United States is on something called humanitarian interventionism. I believe this is one of the worst ideological tricks performed in decades to justify war. And it has no basis in international law, and I'm going to explain why that is and why practically we should be against it. But first of all, let's talk about what is it. So humanitarian interventionism is the notion that countries may intervene in other ones, including militarily, to advance human rights, to stop human rights abuses, to stop genocide. In fact, Congress just passed, I don't know if it was both houses, but at least one house of Congress has passed a law, a genocide law, requiring the U.S. to intervene when there's genocide. Okay. Which sounds great. Obviously, it sounds wonderful. But why is this a problem? First of all, what has happened, and particularly since the 90s, there's always been, by the way, humanitarian interventionism is not a new doctrine. It's existed for as long as war has existed. Because every country that goes to war, even Nazi Germany, claimed it was doing so for noble purposes. No one says they're doing it for bad purposes, right? Most countries say we're intervening, we're going to war to advance democracy. Napoleon said this, right? To protect people. Hitler said that in the Sudetenland, right? To advance human rights. King Leopold of Belgium said this. He went around the world. He'd have parties with the rich and the famous raising money for his humanitarian mission in the Congo. Do you know what he was doing in the Congo? Killing 10 million Congolese. 10 million! And it took a while for people to get wise what his humanitarian project was. One of the people who got wise, by the way, was Mark Twain, who helped form the Anti-Imperialist League. And I think Twain was onto something here. So, but what has happened in recent years isn't just the fact that this doctrine exists and that it's used to justify war, but that it's really become the obsession, I believe, of people, particularly liberals, in thinking about international relations. That is to say that a president, for example, a U.S. president, is not advancing human rights unless he or she is bombing someone. And think about this for a second. Trump was not considered to be presidential, this is true, if you remember this, until he started bombing Syria. And then the newspapers say, finally he's acting presidential, right? Because that's what presidents do. They bomb people. In this case, he was doing it in response to an alleged chemical attack by Assad, which may not have happened. And if it did, it may not have been from him. And I won't get into a lot of that, though I will say a BBC producer has recently said that it was staged. And he was therefore muted by the BBC, and his Twitter account was taken down. But the point is that there is this belief that in order to advance human rights, you must go to war. Libya was a classic case, right? So in Libya, and there's a very important character involved in the Libya invasion that really, I think, helps explain all of this. So you may or may not recall that in 2011, we had one of the quickest humanitarian interventions ever. So in February of 2011, protests began against Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. In February 2011. By March, within weeks, NATO was bombing Libya before anyone could even know fully what was happening on the ground. And this intervention was pushed by three people in particular: Hillary Clinton, Susan Rice, and Samantha Power. Now, Samantha Power is an interesting character. You may, I assume people know who she is. Can I see a show of hands? Who knows who Samantha Power is? Okay. Not many. Well, I'll tell you who she is. She won the Pulitzer Prize for a book she wrote called A Problem from Hell. And the problem from hell she was talking about was genocide. It's a 1,000-page book detailing various genocides. And it's a very influential book. And the upshot of the book is that these genocides have happened around the world and the West has turned away. They haven't done enough or done anything to stop them. So her, of course, conclusion is the U.S. must now act, affirmatively and even militarily at times to stop these genocides. What is very interesting about that book is none of the genocides mentioned in there are Western genocides. It's all about other people's genocides and how we didn't do enough to stop them. She doesn't talk about the Congo. And I don't mean the Congo under King Leopold. I mean the Congo of the 90s, where 6 million Congolese were killed with the help of the United States. She helps encourage the invasion of Libya to protect human rights. First of all, based on 3 lies. 3 things that were utterly untrue and provably untrue. 1, she and Clinton and others said that Gaddafi was giving out Viagra to his troops to engage in mass war. Right? On its face, laughable. I'm glad you're laughing. Did someone laugh? I laughed too. Because it's an absurd claim. It turned out to be untrue. Okay. 2, they said he was about to commit a genocide in Benghazi. There's no evidence of this. His troops were not even on the move towards there. And by the way, Gaddafi offered for the UN to go and inspect Benghazi before they invaded, so he could prove to them this wasn't happening, and they didn't do it. But the 3rd lie was the very worst lie. In a way, an ironic lie, because it was the lie that led to a genocide. Because they claimed that Gaddafi was using black mercenaries to carry out atrocities in Libya. In fact, you know what the paper said, how you could tell who the black mercenaries were? By their yellow hard hats. And you know why? They weren't mercenaries. As Amnesty International would later conclude, they were construction workers. These were black Africans who Gaddafi welcomed into Libya as migrant workers. And the U.S. claimed they were black mercenaries. And why it was important they were black mercenaries, I don't know. Maybe like black ice or whatever. But what happens is, as the war progresses, the people that the U.S. and NATO are supporting, the jihadists, begin to kill black Africans, begin to put them in jail, begin to engage in ethnic cleansing, destroying entire communities of thousands of black Africans. And you know what they're doing today, if you read the papers. Black Africans are being sold on the streets in slave markets. This is the upshot of our great humanitarian intervention into Libya. We didn't stop a genocide, we created one. And one of the people who helped do it was the woman who warned us against genocide, Samantha Power, because she is so blinded by her belief that the West stops genocide, we don't create them. When we kill 2 to 4 million people in Vietnam, because they're Vietnamese, right? Even if they're just children, women, elderly, that's not a genocide, right? If we kill 6 million in the Congo, that's not a genocide. Right now, the U.S., and the Pope just mentioned this over the weekend, is supporting the Saudi massacre in Yemen. The UN has estimated between 14 and 20 million people will die because of this. This is not a case, as Power would urge us to believe, of where the U.S. needs to intervene to stop a genocide. No, as in most cases, it's a case where the U.S. and the West needs to stop intervening to prevent the genocide, because we're causing the genocide. We sold cluster bombs to Saudi Arabia. We've been refueling their planes midair so they can bomb villages and schools and hospitals in Yemen, killing tens of thousands, probably ultimately millions. And you know what Samantha Power did about that? She, in the Obama administration, began the war on Yemen. Not Donald Trump. Obama did. And when there was a move at the Security Council to pass a resolution for the Security Council to investigate war crimes in Saudi Arabia, Samantha, the genocide queen, power, intervened to prevent that investigation from happening. And so we see this incredible hypocrisy and, again, moral blindness when it comes to this. And yet most people, because of the way that they are taught in schools and the way that they learn these things from the news, however, are looking for the next place for us to intervene to protect human rights. When, as Eduardo Galeano, who wrote The Open Veins of Latin America, very correctly said, every time the U.S. intervenes to save a country, it converts it either into an insane asylum or a cemetery, which is invariably true. And so I assert, from a practical and moral point of view, that we should not be looking for the next humanitarian intervention. We need to stop the next intervention. And the law supports me on this, and this is where I'll get into the law. So I have up here, I know it's small type, but I'll read it to you. This is Article 2 of the UN Charter. Little background on the UN and the UN Charter, first of all. They were created after World War II. And they were created for one main purpose: to prevent war. And in fact, I have a great quote here from Noam Chomsky. He says that the Nuremberg Tribunal determined that aggressive war is, quote, the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes, in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole, unquote. So what does this mean? It means there are acts of genocide. There are humanitarian law violations. There's human rights violations. There's many types of violations. But war contains in itself all of these. And in fact, it tends to be the necessary prerequisite for these things to happen. In the case of the Holocaust, that was true. The famous death camps weren't in Germany. They were in Poland. Hitler had to intervene and take over other countries to carry out the Holocaust. And the main goal of the Nuremberg tribunals and judges was to prevent another aggressive war that would lead to that sort of crime. And so we have right up front, in Article 2 of the UN Charter, I'll call your attention particularly to Article 2.4. All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the UN. This is very clear. You are not to threaten other countries with war, nor go to war with them. There is one exception. Well, there's two, really. You can, on a temporary basis, use force if, in the words of Article 51, which follows, you are subject to an armed attack. Okay? And the UN, the International Court of Justice, and the UN has been very clear what this means. It has to be an armed attack. Okay? For the U.S., for example, to be justified to attack Venezuela, either through military attack or sanctions, which is another form of attack, we have to be subjected to an armed attack by Venezuela, which has never happened and will never happen. There is no basis in law to attack Venezuela. There was no basis in law to attack Libya under this idea. Libya was not attacking either any country in the West or anyone even near it in the region. In fact, that's why the lie about the black mercenaries, this was the hook that those who wanted the intervention needed, because the other things they were claiming, while bad, didn't affect international peace and security, which you'll see often. International peace and security, you'll see that many times throughout the UN Charter. That's the main thing the UN is supposed to do, is to promote and protect international peace and security. Well, there was no international aspect to the Libya situation, except based on the lie that he was bringing in people from other countries to fight. See, that was the hook, and that was why it was very important. But the point is, unless there's an armed attack, you don't have a right to go and attack other countries, right? This has been a forgotten part of the UN Charter. If you look at Article 2.7, it again says, notwithstanding all the other things in the UN Charter, which do talk about human rights, other things, it says nothing contained in the present Charter shall authorize the UN to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. So again, a real emphasis on non-intervention. Of course, the second way you can get to an intervention is to get Security Council authorization for an intervention. Because the Security Council is the only body in the UN that can authorize the use of force and can authorize sanctions, right? And the U.S. rarely even bothers to do this anymore. In the case of Libya, the U.S. did prevail on the Security Council to authorize a no-fly zone for the purpose of protecting civilians. But there was no Security Council resolution which allowed the U.S. and NATO to continue in the way they did towards regime change. Moreover, it ended up being a very selective protection of civilians that followed. With, again, I would argue, and we see to this day, because Libya's in the news now, because there's now continues to be warring factions fighting each other. People are much worse off now than they were before the intervention. But again, the lessons of World War II, I believe World War II and the UN Charter that came out of it, the lessons that were learned initially have now been turned on their head. Again, World War II, the lesson now is, oh, you know, we shouldn't have let, you know, Hitler into Poland or Czechoslovakia, and, you know, we can't allow another Munich. Now everything about World War II is about how we should have gone to war earlier. And I'm not saying that isn't true. Obviously, World War II was a special case. But the point is, that wasn't what the Nuremberg judges thought was the main lesson. The main lesson was, how do we prevent states like Germany from engaging in aggressive war? That was the main lesson that they learned. But again, we have these folks like Samantha Power who've done a very good job, I think, convincing people quite the opposite of what they should think about these things. And it's very interesting because to this day, so she's, I don't know what she's doing now. She moved back to Boston and she has a Twitter account. And she continues to tweet about how terrible things are in Yemen, but without acknowledging her own role in how it came to pass that Yemen is the disaster it is. It's very interesting. One case I would throw out at you, one of the most important international law cases which deals with this subject, is the case of Nicaragua versus the United States in 1986, which is usually the first case I assign in my class. So Nicaragua brought a case against the United States at the International Court of Justice, which is the highest court in the world. It was created by the UN Charter, again, to mediate disputes between countries in the interest of international peace and security. And Nicaragua sued the U.S. For damages and for injunctive relief for the U.S.'s support of the Contras in Nicaragua, for the U.S.'s mining of the Nicaraguan harbors, for the U.S.'s bombing of Nicaraguan refineries. And almost on all counts, the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court, ruled against the U.S. and in favor of Nicaragua. But within it, within the decision, the World Court is very clear because they say, well, you know, we know one of the things the U.S. is claiming is that they're doing all these things to support human rights in Nicaragua. First of all, they didn't believe that because, of course, everything we were doing were undermining human rights in Nicaragua. In fact, interestingly, in regards to the mining of the harbors the World Court chastised the U.S. for not even telling its own allies that it mined the harbors. And so a French ship was blown up and another one. There was no argument that human rights or anything like that was of concern. But even if it were, the World Court made it clear that there's no such thing as humanitarian interventionism, that you can't, it still wouldn't justify what the U.S. was doing unless the U.S. or a country it was aligned with had been subject to an armed attack, which no one believes ever happened. So that case is very interesting. And of course, how the U.S. reacted to the case is just as illuminating. That the U.S. said, okay, one, we're not going to abide by the judgment. So it was estimated the U.S. at that time owed Nicaragua about $400 billion because of the judgment. They said, we're not going to pay it. We're not going to stop what we're doing. And moreover, we're not going to be subject to World Court jurisdiction anymore unless we want to be. We're going to decide on a case-by-case basis whether we're going to be subjected to international law, right? Which is a quite interesting reaction for a country that argues all the time it's promoting international law and human rights and is always saying, oh, this and that guy should be subjected to the International Criminal Court. Of course, the U.S. has never signed on to the International Criminal Court. And you saw recently some investigators from the International Criminal Court sought visas to come to the U.S. and they were rejected because we are not subjected to these. In the end, the U.S. position and the position of people like Samantha Power on human rights and international law is that it's for suckers. It's for the weak, right? As one guy said, humanitarian intervention, it was Jean Bricmont, he wrote a great book, Humanitarian Imperialism. He said, humanitarian interventionism is like the Mississippi River. It only flows north to south. It's a doctrine for the rich to attack the weak. And you see, for example, in cases of Venezuela now, where we've engaged in incredibly hostile attacks against Venezuela. We have sanctions which are destroying their economy, right? Right now, for example, Trump announced Venezuela's oil company, Citgo, is free to sell as much oil in the U.S. as it wants to us. We love your oil, but we're going to keep the money. We have frozen $7 billion in Venezuela's money in the United States. Meanwhile, we tried to give them $20 million in aid. And we're holding $7 billion. And we've cut Venezuela off from all international financing through Trump's sanctions of August 2017. They can't get loans. They can't refinance their debt. The Bank of England has $1.5 billion in gold deposits from Venezuela. They told Venezuela they won't give it to them. So we're engaged in acts of war against this country. And what has Venezuela done in return? Nothing. They've never done anything to us. And they can't and they won't. There's not an armed attack and there never will be. There's no justification in law or morality for what we're doing to this country. Meanwhile, of course, these sanctions are creating humanitarian and human rights issues in that country. The one guy who's been talking out about this is the one guy you'll never hear in the mainstream press. His name is Dr. Alfred de Zayas. He was the UN expert sent to Venezuela to investigate the effect of the sanctions. And he's been very clear that the sanctions is killing people. It's preventing people from getting medicine they need, preventing them from getting food they need. And he's concluded that the sanctions are the main thing that have wrecked the Venezuelan economy and not incompetence or whatever of the Venezuelan government. It's the sanctions. And yet you will see human rights organizations like the Washington Office on Latin America, WOLA, and others who support the sanctions, saying they're nonviolent, when there's nothing nonviolent about that. In the case of Iraq, for example, you might recall that under the Clinton administration, we actually prevailed on the UN to impose sanctions against Iraq, which the UN ended up concluding killed 1 million Iraqis, including 500,000 children. 500,000 children. If anything would require a humanitarian intervention, it might be to save 500,000 children. But our intervention was killing them. And then when Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who is considered this great elderly statesman, a great feminist, she's famous now for her these brooches she wears and stuff. And actually, she was in Pittsburgh where some museum had a display of her brooches. When she was asked, was it worth it that 500,000 children died because of our sanctions, she said it was worth it. And this is a great human rights leader of the United States. But this Alfred de Zayas, again, who was the UN expert tasked to investigate this, and who has written a report on this, cannot get an airing in the mainstream press. And you'll never hear him quoted, though you can find it if you want. You can find him in a lot of places, but it tends to be...
Spell his name.
Yeah, so it's Alfred de Zayas, small d-e, another word, Z-A, capital Z-A-Y-A-S. And so, but again, many people continue to be under an illusion that somehow Donald Trump, and it's interesting, even many people who don't like Trump on every other issue, right? They think he's stupid and a liar and mean, probably all true. They think he's going to bring human rights to Venezuela through the next intervention. Meanwhile, you know the guy who Trump appointed, or Mike Pompeo appointed, the special advisor on Venezuela, the guy who's heading up the U.S.'s policies in Venezuela right now is Elliot Abrams.
Oh.
Right? Well, what is he famous for? He covered up the Guatemalan genocide, which killed 200,000 people, which the U.S. was part of. He covered up the El Mozote massacre in El Salvador, in which U.S.-backed forces killed 1,000 people over the course of a couple days, mostly women and children. And he denied it happened. He was part of the Iran-Contra scandal. So the Contras were so bad that even Congress twice, in what was known as the Boland Amendments, cut off U.S. aid to the Contras. Well, so Reagan decided we're going to fund him anyway by selling arms to Iran and selling cocaine, right? Elliot Abrams was a key figure in the Iran-Contra scandal. In fact, he was sentenced and went to jail for a time for lying to Congress about his role in it. He was later pardoned by George H.W. Bush. This is the guy who is now head of U.S. policy towards Venezuela. This is the guy who's going to bring human rights to Venezuela. It would be a joke if it weren't so horribly, horribly sad. And the one person who did it was the new congresswoman, the Muslim congresswoman. What's her name? Yeah, did you see? She took Elliot Abrams on in a hearing, and she said, so what's your plans for Venezuela? Another El Mozote?
Oh.
Right? So some people don't have their heads up their butts on this, but most do. And they think that somehow a regime change in Venezuela is going to improve that country. Like every other regime change the U.S. has been involved in, which of course has always done the opposite. And let me talk a little bit then about Venezuela, and the nature of Venezuela, the nature of the government, the nature of the revolution there. So, how am I doing my time? Good. So first of all, you cannot know about Venezuela or understand Venezuela today if you don't know about the Caracazo. Can I see a show of hands of people who know about the Caracazo? Okay, I see 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Can I also ask for a show of hands of people who know about Tiananmen Square? Everyone. Okay. These two events happened in the same year, 1989. The death toll that's estimated in both events is equivalent. In China, it was estimated, again, it's an estimate, people don't know for sure, but somewhere between 300 and 3,000 people were killed in the Tiananmen Square massacre. Similarly, in the Caracazo, it's estimated 300 to 3,000 people were killed in the Caracazo in Venezuela. And yet, there's no 25th year commemoration for the Caracazo. There is for Tiananmen Square, right? Tiananmen Square events were covered every day, if you were alive during that time. Every day it was on the news, right? Huge event. Venezuela, that had 25 million people at that time, lost the same number of lives as China with about 1 billion. Meanwhile, what changed in China due to Tiananmen Square? Nothing. Historically, it's not a significant event. Nothing changed. In Venezuela, the history of Venezuela and Latin America changed because of the Caracazo. But you never know it, because you never heard of it, most of you. So what is it? So in 1989, the new president of Venezuela, who had run on a platform of opposing IMF austerity measures in Venezuela, right after his election, initiated IMF austerity measures in Venezuela. The price of oil doubled, as did public transportation. The poor of Venezuela, who were already suffering, went nuts. And they protested, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently. There was some looting. Meanwhile, the security forces of Venezuela, the president, first of all, suspended all constitutional rights, and the military and police, they went crazy, and they started shooting people in the streets. Mass graves were found later. A friend of mine who was 10 years old at the time remembers, in his neighborhood, remembers bodies being piled up by the army onto trucks and sent away. It's a huge event in Venezuela. Very traumatic event, as you could imagine. And that is the Caracazo, which gives rise to Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez is a soldier. A couple years later would try to lead a coup against the government. He failed. He was put in jail. Others tried a coup months later. Ultimately, Chavez was freed, and he ran for office in 1998, and he was elected. And his constituency were the poor who suffered under the Caracazo. And so that event is a very critical event. And again, the fact that you don't know about it, most of you, is also very critical, because it shows the double standards and the way that the propaganda system works. Because, of course, at the time, that president was very close to the United States. Right? There was no call for humanitarian interventionism then. Again, the news didn't even cover it. So meanwhile, when Chavez becomes president in 1999, he quickly creates social programs for the poor. Year after year after year, Venezuela is applauded for decreasing poverty and extreme poverty by huge percentages, of creating social programs for the poor, free health care, transportation, hot lunches in the schools, and even doing international work. For example, Venezuela and Cuban doctors were, as the New York Times would later describe it, on the front lines of fighting cholera in Haiti after the earthquake. He would open up a constituent assembly in which the Constitution was rewritten through committees throughout the nation, and there was a national referendum which approved the new Constitution. And the new Constitution was important in many ways, including that it was more democratic. Okay. And ultimately, you might recall, Jimmy Carter would later say in 2005 that Venezuela had the best electoral system in the world of the 92 elections he witnessed. And he said much better than the United States. And Chavez was important to creating that system. But the other thing, in addition to social benefits, in addition to trying to democratize Venezuela, the Constitution enshrined the rights of people who, up to that point, had been invisible in that country. And I'm talking about the rights of Afro-Venezuelans and indigenous people. Most of the country of Venezuela is not white. Most of Venezuela is mestizo or Afro-Venezuelan or indigenous. That's Venezuela. But if you look at the protests today, and I urge you to do it, look at a photo of the protest of the opposition and look at a photo of the people protesting in favor of the government. The opposition people are invariably white, more well-to-do people. The people protesting for the government are darker-skinned poor people. And that is a fact. The U.S. has aligned with the white elite in Venezuela against people of color. Does that shock you? It shouldn't. And yet, again, liberals who seem to otherwise care about such issues are rooting for the opposition, who are very clear about what they want. They want Venezuela back in their hands. They resent the fact it was put in the hands of black people, and that is just a fact. They considered Chavez black, and they would make fun of him. They would, with racial stereotypes. So did the U.S. Embassy do the same thing. And they think of Maduro in the same way. These are the people that the U.S. wants to put into power. These are not our friends. These are not the friends of humanity. And yet this is a reality that's generally obscured by the press. And I can tell you, and I've been to Venezuela many times in recent years. I've been an election observer probably 6, 7 times. That the poor of Venezuela and historically oppressed ethnic groups, despite all the problems that exist in that country, and there are problems, are very clear they don't want to go backwards. They don't want to go back to the days before Chavez. They are better off now, even with all the problems. Right? And even to this day, despite the sanctions, which have crippled the Venezuelan economy, and despite all the problems, Venezuela still spends 70% of its revenue on social programs, including building houses for the poor. The Bolivarian government has built 2.5 million housing units. If you figure average family of 4 times 2.5 million, that's 10 million people who've been housed out of a country of 30 million. And the one thing you rarely see, frankly, on the streets of Venezuela is homeless people. Because that's one thing they've really done, is build housing. Very much unlike almost every major United States city. If you've ever been to San Francisco or Seattle or Louisville or Pittsburgh, you see a lot of homeless, you see tent cities. And again, no one's calling for a humanitarian intervention here. It's very, very strange, again, how this ideology works. And I think part of it, there's a lot of reasons for it and why it's so powerful. And I think one reason people really latch onto it is it's all externally focused. We can consider other people's problems and failures and shortcomings. And every country that's tried to become independent and tried to build a different system, we always focus on everything they've done wrong and nothing that they've done right. Meanwhile, with the U.S., we do just the opposite. In fact, one of my favorite quotes of all time is by former President George W. Bush, who said in 2016, in fact, it's the lead quote of my Russia book. I'm sure he didn't make it up, but it's a great quote. He says, we judge ourselves by the best of our intentions, and we judge others by the worst of their actions. And it's absolutely true. And so while we claim we care about the 30 million suffering people in Venezuela, people who are suffering largely because of us and our sanctions. No one talks about the 40 million people living in poverty in the United States. More than the entire population of Venezuela. The UN just did a study of poverty in the US. They went to Alabama. They said they've never seen such poverty in a so-called developed country, with neighborhoods that had open sewage. Yeah, Flint, of course, famous for its lead water. Of course, we know they're not unique. We know many cities have lead in the water. We have roads that are falling apart, bridges. And of course, we're the wealthiest country on earth. What's our excuse? And yet that isn't a matter for consideration. That isn't a matter that anyone else should tell us about. And if the International Criminal Court comes a knocking, we're not going to let them in because we can solve our own problems. Well, the Venezuelans think they can solve their own problems. And they want to be able to do that. And I think under the law, they have to be required to be able to do that. Okay. I've talked long enough. I'll take any questions, concerns, etc. Thank you. Yeah.
Do you think there's any relation between what's going on in Venezuela and what's happening, or what recently was happening in Haiti with all of the government protests and like the $2 billion missing in the petrol funding?
Well, absolutely.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so he asked about the relationship between Venezuela and Haiti. I mean, clearly well, first of all, as we know, that Haiti has been long suffering for a long time, mostly because at the hands of the U.S., Canada, and France. For example, their president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, was kidnapped in 2004, do you remember this? By all three of those countries, and put on a plane against his will to Central Africa. Okay, that was our humanitarian intervention. And things have gotten much worse there since. So they have been very unhappy for a long time. Of course, we know that there was the earthquake in 2010, and billions of dollars was given for rebuilding and humanitarian aid, and we know that was all largely squandered. The Red Cross, for example, this was in Time Magazine reported this, that they, with the $1 billion they got for rebuilding, they built 6 homes in Haiti. That's your tax dollars at work and your donations you gave online. 6 houses, right? But certainly the timing, we know that the Haitians were saying, oh, okay, U.S., you support uprisings against governments you think are tyrannical. We're going to have an uprising. That's exactly what happened in Haiti. And of course, what did the U.S. do there? They supported the government against the people. And there have been some horrible atrocities carried out recently in Haiti. Mass killings, rapes, by paramilitary forces, of course, that the U.S. created decades ago and has ruled Haiti through those for a long time. So absolutely there is a relationship between those two. And again, the way you see how the U.S. treats one versus the other is pretty incredible. I mean, if anyone has a humanitarian crisis in this hemisphere, it's Haiti. And again, it's a crisis created in the United States. In fact, Bill Clinton, amongst all the other crimes the U.S. has committed against it, Bill Clinton would later admit that his agricultural policies towards Haiti, he says, while benefiting some Arkansas farmers, made it impossible for Haitians to feed themselves. And so when trouble has come to Haiti, they have not been able to, they've not had food that they've grown for themselves because we totally undermine their domestic crops. But in any case, yeah, there will not be a call for humanitarian intervention soon in Haiti, and they will continue to suffer. And of course, ironically or not ironically, the sanctions against Venezuela are now hurting Haiti because we're trying to, we're preventing Venezuela from selling oil to anyone, including Haiti, and they were selling it at cut rate. And now you see pictures of people lining up to try to get gasoline in Haiti. So, and now we're trying to cut them off from Cuba. Again, this is not a humanitarian campaign. This is an old-fashioned imperial act of domination. In fact, there was a senior Trump official who made that very clear. He said that the U.S. sanctions against Venezuela were like Darth Vader's death grip against the country. Well, first of all, that suggests we have no concern for the Venezuelan people because you would not identify with Darth Vader's cruelty. But I think even more importantly and more revealingly, though I think inadvertently that statement was, Vader represents the empire, not the rebels. And it's very interesting. I'm a movie buff myself. I saw Star Wars when it first came out, right? And when I was a kid, all of us identified with the rebels, and we all kind of thought they were like the U.S., right? And we thought Vader and the Empire was maybe the Soviet Union or something. Although, as I got older, I talked to people who grew up in the '60s, and a lot of them said, "No, we thought the rebels were the Vietnamese, and Vader and those guys were the U.S." But in any case, here you have a guy who openly, from the Trump administration, identifies with Vader and the Empire, because that's exactly what is happening here. And yet you have liberals who are backing Darth Vader, cheering him on, in a very bizarre, upside-down world type situation. Yes?
I just wanted to make mostly a quick point just in terms of in the spirit context as well, that the other thing, not only do we have the election of Donald Trump in the United States, but you have seen a series of what had previously been sort of left-center governments in Latin America that have now, are in the hands of very right-wing governments, particularly in Argentina and Brazil. And that has allowed, one of the things that was a little bit of a break on U.S. designs on Venezuela was that there were countries were willing to stand up, and now it's Mexico and Uruguay are the only countries that are not on board with our regime change plan. So that's the other thing that's going on.
And not by accident.
No, of course not.
Right, as I mention in my book there, The Plot to Control the World, and as I do in my Venezuela book, the U.S. has very systematically gotten rid of those left-wing governments, right? The U.S. backed a coup in Honduras in 2009, which got rid of a Chavez ally. The U.S., again, got rid of Aristide in Haiti. The U.S. helped pave the way for Bolsonaro to be elected in Brazil by working, our Justice Department worked with the Brazilian Justice Department to charge and arrest and put in jail the most popular politician in Brazil, Lula da Silva, who continues to sit in jail and who would have won the last election with 80% of the vote. But he was in jail. But that's democracy. Yes?
We have a class coming in at 1.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry to cut you short.
Okay.
I want you to take 60 seconds and give us our takeaway. What do we do?
Okay. Well, I think that I'm losing time. Okay. I think we need to build a peace movement. I think if people care about any issue, it's linked to our military. If you want Social Security and you want Medicare for all, and you want freer education, you can't spend $6 trillion on the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. You can't spend $1 trillion a year on the military. These wars are killing us.
That's right.
And by the way, if you're an environmentalist, do you know the U.S. military creates more CO2 than any single country? More than China, more than the U.S. as a country. So if you care about the environment, you'll want the military cut down. You would want the military to stop being funded so we can build some roads in this country and build some bridges. We have to build a peace movement. We have a long history in this country of peace movements, of anti-imperialism. But again, I go back to what I believe is the core problem here. All those things have gone away because people are drunk on this drug of humanitarian interventionism. It is a bad religion, and it is very powerful. And I would say every time you watch the news or listen to the news or read anything, think about how that bad religion is being pushed on you, and just say no. Thank you.